Okay, today we'll be doing the chapter of hormones. And for the chapter of hormones, there are a few things that you need to take note. Number one, what is the definition of hormones? This is usually a 2-3 marks in exam. And then of course you will need to be able to differentiate the where hormones are secreted from or where they are produced. Effects of some of these hormones, for example, insulin, glucagon, adrenaline. And finally, comparing hormonal system with your nervous control, something that we have learned in the previous lesson. So what are generally hormones, right? Hormones are what we call chemical substances, right? That are produced in very minute quantities by the endocrine gland. So over here, we could see that there are a few differences or components. Number one, chemical substance. So different from enzymes, then they may or may not be protein in nature. Second, minute quantities. Minute quantities means small quantity, okay? Small amount. And of course, by your endocrine glands. Later we will be looking into what's the meaning of endocrine later on. Okay, so in a nutshell, these are the different areas of the glands in your body and the kinds of hormones they secrete. In the brain, you have the hypothalamus, and generally they would regulate the secretion of your pituitary hormones. For example, your ADH, which is your antidiuretic hormone. This hormone actually deals with the water regulation of your body. For example, the meaning of antidiuretic means preventing you from getting dehydrated. So what will happen is if you have high secretion of ADH, your body will actually selectively reabsorb more water to prevent yourself from actually losing water and getting dehydrated. Then of course you have your oxytocin, which is another hormone secreted by your hypothalamus. And another area which in the brain that secretes all this that actually secretes hormone is actually your pituitary gland. This is actually one of the master endocrine gland that is in your body. So this component is very important because it actually produces hormones or sometimes signals to your other glands to control their secretion. So if this is faulty, your other body would also affect your other body hormonal system will also be affected. Some of these hormones that are secreted by your pituitary gland are again like your ADH, your antidiuretic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and your luteinizing hormone. All these are actually involved in the menstrual cycle, which we will be discussing in the following chapter of reproduction in humans. Next, if you look at A is actually your thyroid gland, and this secretes your thyroxine. What generally it does is mainly able to control the rate of metabolism and physical development, for example, your height, your build, etc. So sometimes when someone has an oversecretion of the thyroxine, they tend to be a lot bigger in size, larger in size. Whereas someone who is lesser of that will actually be smaller or shorter in size. But at the same time, too much of a good thing can also be harmful to your body. So these are some things to take note. Then you have your thymus. The thymus would be your E, and they secrete your thymosin. This helps to stimulate the development of antibodies. Antibodies are special chemicals or components that helps to fight off, try to not say fight off bacteria or what's not, but to help your white blood cells to actually detect such bacteria in your body. Okay, then of course you have your adrenal glands, which secretes adrenaline. This is important as this is one of the main hormones you will have to learn in this chapter. Adrenaline is a special hormone that helps you to actually perform a fight or flight mechanism. As the name suggests, fight and flight is more of like to prepare your body for a fight movement or a flight means running away movement. So this can be increasing your metabolic rate, making you more active. Just like in the movie when you watch, like someone is about to die, then they have a sudden injection of adrenaline. Then they suddenly woke up in high spirits and high activity. So that's an example of one. And next, if you look at F, you have your pancreas. This is the other one that is important in your exams, where you will need to know the two hormones that are being secreted, which are your insulin and glucagon through your islet of Langerhans. So insulin and glucagon, they help to regulate the metabolism of glucose and glycogen in your body, and this can be seen in the chapter of nutrition in humans. Okay, next we have your ovaries that will secrete estrogen progesterone that helps to aid in female reproductive system, especially the menstrual cycle. Then, of course, it also gives some of your female characteristics. Okay, and then H would be the one present for males, the testis that secretes testosterone. So hormones, other than that of being chemical substance that are produced in small amount in the endocrine gland, they are generally transported by blood to the targeted organs, not just to organs, but to targeted organs, meaning to specific organs that they are bound to actually react with. Okay, and like just we shared just now, there are many different types of them that, and some of them or most of them actually helps to influence growth, development, and the activity of an organism. Okay, and after performing their function, they are generally destroyed in the liver and slowly subsequently are excreted by the kidney. How they are destroyed in the liver, not they will not be tested in the exam. So for hormones like oxytocin, they help the delivery of baby out of the mother's womb during childbirth. All these were things that we have already discussed in the previous slides. Okay. So if you want, you can actually pause the video to see how oxytocin's role in terms of child delivery. Well, do note that these will not be tested in your exam. So how do hormones actually affect the body? Number one, the production of hormones has to be carefully controlled because um, they can be, if too much, the bodies, it will affect the other body's mechanism, and that will cause failure for your body. So too much or too little generally will affect the organism greatly. For example, too little thyroxine in a tadpole will inhibit its growth into its frog, so it will just stuck at the tadpole stage without any limbs produced. Whereas too much thyroxine will actually turn a tadpole into an adult too quickly, resulting in the frog to be very, very small. That means it's like a sudden growth spurt, and then from there you become short. So I believe you have seen some of your friends who during primary school they had a sudden shot up of height. Then after that they stop growing already. So something similar can happen as well. So where are hormones generally produced? They are produced in the endocrine gland. There's a difference between production and secretion. So production is the one that really creates, synthesize it, and to produce it, whereas secretion is the one that release it. So if I were to give an analogy, let's say a factory is the one that produce your toys and what's not. The one that secretes the toy is maybe your toy shop. The toy shop doesn't make the toy, but instead it sells the toy away. So the toy represents the hormone. Okay, so hormones are released directly into the blood without the use of ducts. Um, and that such ducts and such glands have an extensive network of blood vessels to transport the hormones to their targeted organs. So in this case, right, what is so special about this? The meaning of duct, you imagine it to be like some special vessel that will actually channel like a pipe to channel all the hormones to a particular organ. But because most of the hormones in our body tends to be able to affect many different types of organs, and since we have so many hormones, it is actually not viable to have so many ducts everywhere. Because one thing we want when for glands that with the duct, right, is generally to increase the speed of actually transporting the hormone to the targeted organs as compared to the bloodstream. So the nature of this is that we most of our hormones in our body are generally released directly into the blood, and within the specific component of the hormone, they are able to move to the targeted organ through the bloodstream. And in this case, we also do note that in our human system, the circulatory system is actually a very wide network of blood vessels, so we are quite safe in terms of the hormone reaching to the targeted organs, just that maybe it's slower. So the two types of glands are endocrine gland and exocrine gland. So the meaning of exocrine and endocrine means that for endocrine, we are looking at ductless glands, glands that doesn't have that vessel attached to the targeted organs. So its main mode of transportation is through the bloodstream. Whereas exocrine gland, they are ducts present to transport secretion to the targeted organs. And in this case, they don't really travel through the bloodstream. So some examples are like your sweat glands that will travel, that will be that will produce the sweat, channel to the sweat duct and out into your pores of your skin. Whereas for let's say your islet of Langerhans that produces your insulin glucagon, these will actually travel to the bloodstream to be transported to maybe your different digestive system, digestive tract to to the liver to to convert the to increase the permeability of the liver to take in the glucose so that the liver would actually do the conversion of the excess glucose to glycogen. So what is then the production of, so how is then this production actually controlled? Some of these can be under the nervous or hormonal control. Now, what this means is that nervous comes in through like some form of stimulus, leading to a nervous transportation through the nerve cells or the neurons or your nervous system to command the organ to actually, the gland to actually secrete more hormones. The other one is by hormonal control. So, for example, the signal can be sent to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will then secrete some hormones that will then be channeled to the targeted organs or the targeted gland to secrete more of that hormone. Okay, so production of hormones in the thyroid glands is usually controlled by hormones from other endocrine glands such as your pituitary gland. Whereas for the adrenal gland, it's generally controlled by the nervous system. Why? Because it's like, for example, when you see danger, you want to run away from danger. So that's where the trigger mechanism will be to tell your adrenal gland to secrete more adrenaline to prepare you for a fight or flight action. So for endocrine gland and their hormonal secretion, when we look at the endocrine gland in the body, we look at the pituitary gland. So your pituitary gland is mainly housed in the brain and it generally controls the function of several other endocrine glands. So what it means is just now when we talk about how glands can be activated, the pituitary gland is one such gland that can help to influence the production of other hormones in other glands. And this secretion of many hormones, and some of these hormones control other endocrine glands, for example, your thyroid stimulating hormone, your TSH. Whereas for hypothalamus, it tends to only regulate the secretion of some pituitary hormones. The thyroid gland is stimulated by a thyroid stimulating hormone, your TSH, that is released by your pituitary gland. So when this happens, it will then secrete your thyroxine that can help to control the metabolic rate and influence physical development. Uh, this thyroxine, it exists in both short and long-term effects in the body. What is meant by short-term and long-term? So short-term meaning like only maybe it's effective in a few hours or a few days. Long-term means it can go to a few weeks, years, or even being permanent. So one example is like let's say your height. Your height, if due to child when you birth, of course you develop in terms of height, you grow taller. This effect is long term. It doesn't mean that if let's say I stop production of the hormone, right, you will grow shorter immediately. Then you have a very varying height on a daily basis. So those are short term effect. Okay, adrenaline is also a short term effect where you feel that sudden sugar rush when you are in need of a fight or flight. As compared to imagine if if adrenaline is a long term effect, then you will stay alert all the time. Uh, and I think that's something that we all don't want. Okay, your adrenal gland is situated on the top of each kidney, and when stimulated by the nervous system due to some form of danger stimulation, the hormone adrenaline is actually released, and this causes an increase in the heartbeat and also the rise in your blood pressure. So, in terms of heartbeat, is in order to transport blood around your body faster, and your red blood cells carry oxygen. So, your cells have an immediate reach of oxygenated cells, red blood cells. And what happens is once the cells are able to receive oxygen, it is able to release large amount of energy for aerobic respiration. Blood pressure, in a way, is also another way to push the blood at a high pressure to move faster as well. The pancreas has both the endocrine and exocrine functions, where the exocrine gland tends to secrete pancreatic juice via the pancreatic duct. The islet of Langerhans secretes the insulin and glucagon to help to manage or control the blood glucose level. So in the pancreas, right, they have special cells which we call the islets of Langerhans, and these are actually responsible to secrete hormones of insulin and glucagon into the bloodstream to the targeted organ, which is the liver. Next is the gonades. Gonades is actually the way we call the sex organs, or we would say organs that are responsible to produce your sex cells. Okay, in the females, you have your ovaries that will secrete estrogen and progesterone. The main role of estrogen is to actually control the development of breasts and broadening of the pelvis, but more importantly, it helps to actually start the creation of your uterus lining during menstrual cycle. Whereas progesterone will help to maintain a healthy pregnancy by maintaining the wall of the uterus lining, so that when the fetus when the embryo is being implanted onto the uterus lining, it doesn't break due to menstrual cycle. It will just maintain. In the males, they generally have the testes. Then the testes actually produce testosterone. So testosterone helps to create that male physical characteristics, such as your voice, depending on the voice, and growth of facial hair. So for people who want to go for a sex change, sometimes they will be on a hormonal therapy. And let's say you're a female that wants to go for a physical sex change. Also, what will happen is that sometimes the doctor may prescribe some of these hormones as a hormonal therapy to help you in your transition. Mm. Then, of course, a summary on endocrine glands in the body. So you have your pituitary gland that secretes hormones that control other endocrine gland. You have a hypothalamus that regulates the secretion of some pituitary hormones. Your pancreas will secrete insulin and glucagon, while your adrenal glands will secrete adrenaline. For your males, you will have your testes that will secrete testosterone, and the females will actually have the gonad or ovaries to secrete estrogen and progesterones. So what are some of these effects? So when you look at insulin, right, generally insulin helps to decrease the blood sugar concentration. So what actually causes a triggering, right, is that first of all, you have maybe a glucose-rich meal. Your body will actually detect a sudden increase in glucose. That's where your islet of Langerhans will then produce and secrete more insulin. So when there's an increase in the insulin production, and it's being transported to the blood and then to the targeted organs, that is the liver, this will actually cause all membranes of your cells to actually be more permeable to glucose, especially your liver cells. And when that were to happen, you have more glucose entering to the liver. Excess glucose will then be converted into glycogen for storage by your liver. And in the muscles, when they actually have more glucose entering into your muscle cells, your muscles will actually be able to oxidize this glucose via the process of aerobic respiration to produce your carbon dioxide, water, and of course, large amount of energy. Now, in the event that you have an over-secretion of insulin, what will happen? So, over-secretion of insulin will result in very abnormally low blood glucose concentration, and what it can affect you is that it can make you feel very weak, very tired easily. You feel very hungry. There will be rapid heartbeat, and of course, irritability. So, for very severe case, you may even lapse into a coma or even die. On the other hand, if there is actually a lack of insulin secretion, this will actually result in very high blood glucose concentration. In a way, it's something like diabetes mellitus, where your tissue cells cannot utilize the stored glucose, and that some of these symptoms is you have very weak body, you have very continual weight loss, which is contrary to what people assume when you gain weight because of a lot of sugar. You will have this glucose in the urine, and this is known as diabetes mellitus. So how do we actually treat diabetes mellitus? There is actually two main forms lah. So we usually treat it by insulin injection for both cases. But of course, if you are the mild case, we could actually use insulin tablets, or generally we can even change our lifestyle. So what is this diabetes mellitus? It is this insufficient insulin that's secreted to regulate blood in the blood glucose concentration, and it can lead to very high levels of glucose in the blood. So kidneys are unable to completely reabsorb the glucose in the body, and this will cause glucose to be excreted in the urine. So there's two ways in which you can have this insufficient insulin secreted. Number one, genetics, you are born with it. So your it's not Langerhans is not able to produce and secrete any form of insulin. The other one is through aging and health habits or lifestyle, where your Isler of Langerhans or your insulin are not that sensitive anymore, and therefore they are not able to do that to trigger that level of increased permeability, and of course causing other organs to have to convert the excess glucose into glycogen. So what are some signs of diabetes mellitus? Constantly high blood glucose concentration and presence of glucose in urine after a meal. So generally, this one you can go for a urine test. This is quite straightforward. Another one, if you have diabetes mellitus, is that the healing of wounds is very slow and difficult. Sometimes it can go very bad to the point that you have diabetic foot, and your feet will start to rot, and then you will have to go and amputate your feet. Okay, so two main types of diabetes. We have the type 1 and type 2, where type 1 is early onset, and this is where there is insufficient or no insulin produced. Generally, this happens when it's something like a genetic kind of disorder, or when you're born in it, and the only treatment is by insulin injection. Okay, but of course, you have to be mindful of the insulin injection, because too much insulin injection will also lead you to an overdose of insulin, and you can go to hunger pangs and even coma or death. Whereas type 2 diabetes is late onset diabetes. This insulin is produced, but targeted cells do not actually respond well to insulin. The treatment is by control of dietary intake and exercise. So dietary intake means you don't always drink a lot of bubble tea, you don't do a lot of sweet drinks, you take things in moderation. Okay. The opposite of insulin is what we call glucagon, and glucagon tends to increase the blood glucose concentration. It helps to stimulate the conversion of glycogen into glucose, fats into amino acid and glucose, and of course lactic acid into glucose. So everything is to revert back into the glucose form. And the effect of glucagon is just like how similar we talk about insulin, is that the main target of organ is actually your liver, in which when there's a stimulus of low blood glucose concentration, let's say you're undergoing intermediate fasting and what's not, the ester of Langerhans would then secrete glucagon. More of this glucagon and more glucose is then produced due to the role of glucagon. Like it can does all the conversion for you, and then it increase in the blood glucose concentration. So in this case, it's something related to homeostasis, where we talk about negative feedback mechanism, where what happens when there's an increase in glucose, and that's where insulin comes in. And of course, if it falls below the norm, the negative feedback will be your glucagon, and it shoots it back up. So this is how we regulate it. Okay. The third hormone that we will have to talk about is actually the effect of adrenaline. Adrenaline is secreted in response to stress or excitement, and it allows the body to respond quickly to sudden demands for energy. And these effects are usually very short-lived. Like I say, the role of adrenaline is to prepare you for a fight or flight reaction. So the effects, number one, the stimulus will first activate the sensory neurons in the hypothalamus, that will then result in the adrenal gland to produce even more adrenaline. Adrenaline is then carried in the bloodstream to the targeted organs, and the targeted organs will then be able to respond to this short-term effect. For example, it will make your muscles more active, your heart will actually beat faster, etc. So these are the effects of adrenaline which can come out in an exam essay. or short answer where you have to give some examples, like for example, an increase in blood pressure and heartbeat. This purpose is to mainly increase the flow of blood so that you're able to carry oxygenated blood to the rest of the body for other reaction. Increased rate and depth of ventilation. This is to allow more oxygen to go into your body again to aid in respiration. Cause pupil to dilate and so that you are able to see maybe more clearly. Increase the rate of blood coagulation. Constricting the arterioles in the skin. Contracts the hair muscles, producing goose pimples, and of course, increase blood glucose level and increase metabolic rate. Okay. And finally, the last part where we want to talk about the comparison. So, the effects of hormones, right? What are those in your syllabus is insulin, glucagon, and adrenaline. If you are studying pure bio, it will have to include your antidiuretic hormone. And of course, the other hormones which are scattered around the other chapters are like your estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. So what are some of the similarities? So this question is actually a very common exam question in the essay component, where they will ask you, some form of example of a reflex action, and then you have to give a comparison between the hormonal and nervous system. Usually, in the event of this, they may even give some examples, which you have a lot. You have the insulin, glucagon, and of course, nervous control. You have your reflex action, like the pupil dilation. You also have the knee-jerk reflex reaction. Yeah, so these are some of the things. So, what are some of the similarities? Number one, a detector that detects a stimulus. So for the nervous system, right, you have like let's say sight or sense of sense or sense of smell. So these are the ones that will detect the stimulus. First for your human, for the human body, I mean for the hormonal control, it can be the food you take as another example, or same thing on sight and what's not for danger, and that's for the adrenaline. So a detector that detects a stimulus must always be there. There must be some form of a signal or message that is transmitted to send the information to the other organs or the glands to produce the required action. So for the hormonal one, you would say like like let's say you have a sudden increase in blood glucose level, you will need to send a signal to the islet of Langerhans to generate that amount of insulin to be produced. It can also be from the pituitary gland that sends another chemical signal or hormone to another endocrine gland to secrete more of the hormone. So that's another signal. For nervous system, I think it's quite straightforward. It's through the electrical signal from your sensory neuron to your relay neuron to the brain, and then to your motor neuron to your effector. Then an effector is the one, in this case for hormonal control, it's usually your gland, your endocrine gland. Whereas for nervous system, it's generally the effector is maybe a muscle, or even it's generally the muscles. So the targeted organs that carries out the response. So these are the similarities. Now, when we look closely at the differences, for the nervous control, it involves your neurons, your nerve cells. So there are three in your syllabus: sensory neuron, relay neuron, and of course your motor neuron. Whereas for endocrine control, it usually involves the hormones, not so much of electrical signals. So nervous control is electrical and chemical transmission. Why chemical transmission? Because of your synapse. Those are actually spaces in between the neurons, so it will be nervous system sent through the chemical and then back to the electrical. Whereas for endocrine gland is or endocrine control, it's only the chemical transmission. There's no electrical signal. Nervous control, nerve impulses are transmitted by your neurons, whereas for endocrine control, the hormones are transmitted mainly through the blood via the bloodstream. The nervous control are generally rapid transmission and responses because mostly electrical. So you can see effects immediately, like a pupil reflex, immediate action, how you move your hand, all this is all immediate. Whereas for endocrine, it can have slower transmission and react and relatively slow acting, meaning that the effect of me telling the hormone to move to my targeted organs might be slower in terms of transmission because it travels through the bloodstream. The other one is that it's relatively slow acting. That means it needs time for it to come into effect to your body as compared to the nervous control. Nervous control often cause short-term effects. So what this means is actually the effects are not long-lived. It tends to just happen at a point in time, and after a few minutes, maybe it will stop. Okay, and endocrine gland, it will cause long-term or short-term effect, like what we discussed about the height. Nervous control is voluntary or involuntary. You can actually consciously control it, or it can be a reflex that is not within your control. Endocrine gland is generally or mostly involuntary, so that you can't actually control it. It usually reacts automatically. Nervous control is usually localized response. What is meant by localized response means it's only at a certain area or part of your body. It doesn't go to another part. Like for example, when your hand moves, it only reacts at the hand area. It won't move to the leg and what's not. Whereas for endocrine gland, it's usually widespread effect. That means it can affect your whole body, it can affect multiple limbs at one go. Okay, so that is mostly all for this chapter, and then you can rewatch this if you want to revise. Thank you.